Welcome back to the Pragmatic Guide to Building Muscle. Today we're going to talk about exercise sequencing, which is the next step in developing a training program for ourselves. Now, if you haven't watched the previous few videos, we've already went through why training programs fail people. We've already went through training volume, intensity, frequency. We went through exercise selection, and now this is going to start putting everything together for us. As we have done in every single video thus far, we're always going to refer any decision we make when it does come to either exercise selection, volume, intensity, frequency, or exercise sequencing back through our decision filter. Is it specific for our muscle building goals? Is it progressible? Can we achieve overload with this program and drive stimulus through our sessions? Can we repeat the program? And do we enjoy it? Is it effective? Is it actually going to lead to growth? When we look at exercise order, exercise sequencing, it's important to understand that this is very flexible and there are going to be a lot of different lines of thought within ordering exercise within a session. I hopefully will be able to encapsulate as much of that as I can, but it's important to realize that this is lower down the list of priorities. You can still achieve a pretty decent result with a variety of ways that your training is laid out across the session. Having done tons of training programs over the last 15 years when I've been training, I can tell you I've done training programs where it's been heavily focused on having compounds first and isolations at the end, and almost flipped. And all of those programs drove muscle growth by the end of it. And that's because they still abided by all the principles that we're thinking about when it comes to long-term training adherence. They still adhere to landmarks with their volume, intensity, and frequency. So if I say something in this video that is counter to what you have been getting results with, I'm not here to argue, because there is so many different ways that we can go about this and still achieve muscle growth. But I'm going to give you some considerations. The goal of exercise order and why does that matter? And I'm going to tell you exactly why it does matter. The goal of exercise order is to manage stimulus and fatigue. We want to be able to drive the highest amount of stimulus through the session while ensuring that we're not having too much knock-on effects from either one exercise to the next, so that we get to the end of the session and those final sets are still very effective. If you watched the previous video on exercise selection, we're going to be able to bring the likes of our stimulus fatigue ratio concept into how we put exercises in throughout the actual session. Now over here, what I have is I've got 3 categories. So you have the start, the middle, and the end of our training session. Probably the most important thing we consider at the start of the session is the priority. What are the main muscle groups that we want to hit? We are going to be at our freshest. Freshest equals high output. High output leads to high stimulus. That is the primary thing that we want to think about at the start of the session. And the exercises, the muscle groups that we want to bring up, we want to have them higher up in the exercise order. And that can go for any given day. So if in an upper body day, you really want to bring up your chest, it makes the most sense to have your chest exercises earlier on in the session and have the stronger body parts of your upper body, maybe could be back, for example, falling later on throughout the exercise structure. Now, the other thing we can think about when it does come to what we place first within our session could be some prep work. So for example, if you have an exercise, it could be an isolation-based movement, which you know when you perform it, your further exercises on that body part, they could be big compound movements, for example, that you feel the working muscle hits that a little bit different. Well, now we can place that further up within the exercise structure versus have it later on. This is sometimes debated by people, putting isolations ahead of compounds. People say if you perform an isolation-based movement before your compound, you will have some fatigue generated that could take away from the total amount of workload you can do. However, if you can perform an isolation movement before your compound work and it benefits that movement, this could be a good option. A very common example could be people doing something like a lat pullover or single arm lat pullover before they get into something like a lat pull down or a row movement, okay? Because if they're having an issue connecting with their lats, training pure shoulder extension before they go into something that's going to include the likes of elbow flexion and shoulder extension is possibly going to be something that's going to help them drive a higher level of output and have the target muscle be the thing that's the limiting factor within the exercises. Something else that will fall under prep work could be doing some core work just before you get into the session. A lot of times when people have core work, they tend to skip it. If you want a developed six-pack, if you want a good, strong, stable core, it is likely that if you put it at the start of the session, you're not going to skip it, whereas a lot of people will end up skipping abs if they have it at the end of a session. But we can also consider the impact that this will have, a beneficial impact on our subsequent exercises. So if you're doing a squat pattern, RDL, some type of row, or anything that's really going to require you to stabilize your core, we can look at throwing some type of anti-flexion movement within that first exercise of the session. It could be a dead bug, could be a plank, whatever it may be, to help you get that strong core position that's going to allow you to drive a high level of force into your next movement. When we're looking at producing a high level of force through the lower body, the pelvis will need to be stabilized. If the pelvis is not stabilized, we can start to get some lower back discomfort, and that becomes a limiting factor versus the target muscle. Now, this is another reason why we might consider putting a core movement at the start of the session. But there's some examples that will fall within prep work. We could also look at high skill movements. So anything that is likely going to be free weight, anything that is going to require a high level of focus, that could require that level of bracing, this should likely be performed earlier on in the session. And this can be down to just pure safety. This can encompass anything that's like free weight based. So it could be a free weight squat. It could be a hinge pattern like an RDL or a deadlift. It could be something like a dumbbell press. When we do these exercises earlier on the session, when we have a bit of freshness, we have that high level of focus, we also don't have any lingering fatigue around the muscle groups that are going to be contributing or around the joints that are contributing, but also we have that mental acuity where we're able to just lock in and focus on performing that exercise with the best intent as we can. Because we have to understand that when fatigue generates throughout the session, it will impact coordination and it will just impact focus overall. If we keep these high skill movements at the start of a session, it can lead us to driving more output overall because we are not having this lower state of focus. We are not having fatigue built up throughout the session, which could impact your ability to coordinate the movement and drive stimulus to the target muscle group. And now maybe because coordination is off and fatigue is built up, maybe the weakest muscle group within that chain does start to be the thing that is going to dictate your ability to perform. Again, very common examples are going to be doing some type of hinge work or squat work and lower back being a limiting factor when really we're looking to either train our quads or any of the muscle groups of the posterior chain. Keeping our high skill lifts in early is a good idea. So this can encompass things that are high stimulus, high fatigue. Then if we were really concerned with actual performance in terms of load on the bar, putting some of our strength oriented rep ranges or lifts towards the start, which can kind of encompass the high skill, is going to be important. So if you're working with lower rep ranges, so we're talking like 4 to 8, it's probably better that you put them in early in the session when coordination is at its highest and your focus is there. You're not having any fatigue built up from other exercises or other rep ranges that are used within the day that are going to knock onto your performance here and reduce overall loading on the bar. So from an overview, what we're looking at the start of the session is either going to be priority body parts. It could be something that's going to help us improve our targeting of that priority body part. It could be something that is more compound, free weight, going to have a higher level of skill. It could be something that's a bit more strength oriented. As you move from the start to the middle of the session, we have to understand that we've driven a high level of stimulus to a variety of different muscle groups, especially if we've been picking some more compound based movements at the start, very high skill lifts, maybe strength oriented lifts that are giving us a big bang for our buck at the start of the session. So we're getting a high level of stimulus, but also a high level of fatigue. Now, as fatigue comes into the mix, we're going to have a decrease in total energy reserves. We're going to have a decrease in force output that we can have. We're also going to have a decrease in coordination. So we may now look at performing things more stable, because if you remember from the previous video, we talked about how stability is going to be really important for driving high levels of force output. So if now we're a little bit less fresh here, those stable movement patterns are going to offer us that ability to still drive a high level of stimulus. Great places to look for a high level of stimulus with low levels of skill are going to be machines. That's not to say we can't have machines here, but it is a good place for us to start structure, maybe towards the middle of our training session. Now, one thing we might have done when it does come to the exercise we have at the start of the session, depending on just how high skilled they are, we may not have necessarily pushed all the way to failure. And that can just be due to the inherent risk which comes to pushing something free weight to failure. And this is mainly preserved for something like a hinge, a squat. You push a press to failure, it's not going to be the end of the world. I think everybody knows what it feels like to fail a bench press. Now, a great thing about machines is that because of their high stability and their ability for us to drive a high level of force output, and also the fact that they are on a guided path of motion and typically they're going to be very safe to fail, we can ensure that the level of output we have here is going to be extremely potent. And this is irregardless of the fact we're coming into this portion of the session with a bit of fatigue coming into the mix, because we're going to have less areas that are going to be limiting factors when it does come to utilizing something like a machine. And when we look at things that are safer to fail and we're able to push them all the way to failure, we can say there is a high level of stimulus that can be gained there. Now, while what we're getting at the start of the session is probably going to give us the lion's share of a stimulus for a particular muscle group, as we move into the middle portion, when it does come to targeting particular body parts that may be lesser applied, you may find from doing more of your high skill lifts or more of your compound lifts that one muscle group is a little bit more dominant than the other. Now I'm going to give you two examples here. If we look at a squat, you notice that when you're squatting, you're getting some quad, but you're probably getting a little bit more glute. Maybe as we come into the middle of the session here, we're going for a bit more of a quad biased leg press where you have your feet a little bit lower on the foot plate. This is still going to be something that's going to drive a high level of stimulus. It's not going to be nearly as fatiguing as the squat, but you're not going to have the limiting factors coming up of your lower back, or because you're able to alter your foot position while keeping on the fixed track of the machine, that now you're actually able to drive more stimulus towards the likes of your quads without having any tension really being delivered to the likes of your glutes. We could also look at a press. If you have something like a barbell bench press, or it could even be a Smith machine press, right? Again, these don't have to be barbell movements, but they're just a really good way to illustrate this example. If we have a barbell bench press and you notice that your triceps are the thing that are giving out on you, maybe we may look here in the middle portion of our training session to go into something. It could be an isolated pec fly, but it could be better to pick some type of press that is going to get a little bit more chest activation. Maybe go with a Smith machine press. You angle the bench at about 30 degrees, which you know is going to get pretty good activation of the upper pec fibers as well as the middle pec fibers. But as well, you also perform this move with just focusing on the bottom half of the range of motion. Because you're focusing on the bottom half range of motion, you're going to get mostly pec involvement without having to worry about your triceps being the thing that are the limiting factor, because you're safe to fail the movement. You don't have to go through full extension to rack the bar, because you can just rack it on any of the hooks. This is another example of how we can ensure that we're targeting that muscle group with a high degree of loading, and ensuring that the muscle group that you really want to train is the thing that's getting the most stimulus from that exercise. Towards the middle part of our training session is also a good time to maybe start to incorporate some more classic hypertrophy rep ranges, right? So the majority of our strength work or really high output work is going to be done at the start, and then we can move towards the middle, which maybe we might be working in something that's like the 8 to 12 reps as the classic hypertrophy rep continuum. So as we're coming through a session, we're really thinking about managing that load throughout the entirety so that we can prioritize performance and prioritize this balancing the stimulus and balancing the fatigue. We're having the big shotgun blast of stimulus coming in from our first exercises. As we come into the middle, we're likely still training big multi-joint patterns, but ones that are going to be a little bit more stable, and we're starting to direct more stimulus towards body parts that may not have been hit as well with the likes of our early ones. Now, as we come into the final part of our training session, you have to remember, as we get to this point, our focus is lower. Our ability to accrue a good level of stimulus is also lower. Our fatigue is quite high. So at this point, we shouldn't really be adding in anything that is going to have a high level of skill. It should be something that we could perform pretty much with our eyes closed. So these are going to be mostly single joint movement patterns. So that could be your bicep curl, tricep extensions, could be your leg curl, could be your leg extension, and the likes. These exercises, while still a high level of stimulus, they are not driving as much fatigue as the previous, because we are trying to train individual muscle groups at this point in time. What you have in the end, it still does matter. We want to ensure by the time we get here that we have enough juice in the tank that what we're doing here is going to be effective. So that's really important, that when you're actually making up your training program and you're deciding on the level of training volume you're doing, the amount of exercise you're doing, that when you get here, you still have energy to go. Because if you end up overdoing the volume, if you end up overdoing the likes of your exercise selection, you could get here and just notice that you're doing junk volume. Your sets are no longer effective. You're thinking about getting home and getting to your post-workout meal. A lot of times at the end of the session, you're programming in isolations. We're programming in movement patterns are probably not what we're doing at the start of our session. When we're thinking about balancing stimulus and fatigue across the entire session, we don't want to have any muscle groups that could be affecting our performance on early ones or dominating them being the limiting factor. An example here could be if you decide that you're going to train your biceps in the middle of a pull day when lats are a weak body part. As a result of training your biceps in the middle of the session, you are taken away from your ability to generate a high amount of stimulus from the likes of your lat exercises. Another example could be if you are performing something like adductors before a squatting pattern. Now, with the adductors before a squat pattern, for some people, this helps them feel really good at the bottom and makes them feel really strong and helps them develop more stimulus overall for the lower body. However, for some people, it can cause the adductors to be a limiting factor. Considering that squat pattern, you're going to have the adductor magnus being a really strong hip extensor. Now, if you're using the squat pattern to help develop your quads and you notice your adductors are failing, that is an improper ordering of that exercise, and I'll have the adductor coming later on in the session. One of the reasons we're also putting these isolation movements closer to the end of the session is because they're lower skill. Now, while lower skill movements are not going to have a massive impact on total fatigue, if we do a ton of isolation based movements before we do our compound work, that fatigue accumulates. And while you could say, oh, well, the fatigue is just local, fatigue is fatigue. Your nervous system senses it all the same. And by the time you get towards the end of the session, if you've just done isolation leading up into your compounds, you're not going to be able to perform that compound work as effectively. And considering they are the exercises which have the highest loading capacity, we should really be prioritizing them. Keeping in line with the loadability of the program overall, we're thinking about maybe at the early part of the actual training session, we have more strength oriented rep ranges. Maybe in the middle, we have some more hypertrophy oriented rep ranges. Maybe towards the end, we have some more metabolic work. Metabolic stress, people debate all the time whether it is something that's driving hypertrophy. Using higher rep ranges is just a good way to manage load. Like, you don't necessarily have to use higher rep ranges. If you don't like them, don't do them. A lot of people will find that sometimes higher rep ranges can cause other aspects other than muscle to be the limiting factors, such as cardiovascular fatigue. It could be just your pain tolerance, for example. But if you're going to place metabolic work anywhere, you put it towards the end of the training session. And this could encompass things like intensity techniques. Within that, we have our drop sets, rest pause, AO reps, and supersets. Now, these training methods can be an excellent way to ensure that the exercises at the end of your session are highly, highly effective. Keeping in mind that people are going to be quite fatigued by this point, you're going to maybe have a lower ability to focus. Doing straight sets at the end may not be too palatable. You might also have time constraints, and that's going to come into our decision filter again, where I think about time availability to train. So having these methods at the end of your session is still allowing you to drive a high level of stimulus towards the body parts at the end of the session while making the session a little bit more fun. And then the final thing that we can consider at the end of a workout is low priority movements. So an example here is if you have strong quads, placing more of your quad work at the end of the session may be a better call for you. Maybe this is where you get your maintenance volume in at the end of the week, while glutes, hamstrings, they're more of a focus for you, so they encompass what you have at the start and at the middle of your training session. Now, the last thing before we wrap up is the question on pre-exhaust. Pre-exhaust is a very common exercise technique that people will do if they find that when they're training a particular movement, the target muscle group is not the one that is hit. People will do an isolation movement pattern before the compound that's targeting that muscle group to help it feel like it's involved more. And they're trying to get this body part to now be the limiting factor within the exercise. So an example here would be if you find when you're doing a leg press that your quads are not the limiting factor, you may decide to do a leg extension prior to doing your leg press. As a result, when you perform your leg press, the quads are the limiting factor. The issue with this is that it can be solved with some prep work or simply just with better exercise selection. You have to pick the exercises that are going to work the best for you. However, it is still a technique that can work. By the time we finish the session, we should have the muscles that we've aimed to train be completely dust. If that has not been achieved, we need to change something, whether that's volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection, or exercise ordering. If you know you have a good level of volume and training program, the next thing to look at is exercise ordering. Have a play around with these different variables, try different approaches, because you will find that one style will work better for you than the other. I've tried a variety of different combinations. I've tried powerlifting programs where I've emphasized high scale lifts at the start and isolations last. Currently doing bodybuilding, I have the inverse. I've got a lot of isolation based movements at the start and a lot more compounds at the end. And both of delivered growth. Those big picture items always ran through the decision filter. This has been exercise sequencing. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you learned from it or have any of your own inputs, I'd love to hear them in the comments. If you did enjoy the video, please consider hitting the like button. If you're not subscribed, please do subscribe. And in the next video, we're going to go through time under tension and rest periods. Thank you very much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.